Ambassador Sarah Chen walked through the massive corridors of the Galactic Confederation Council building. The walls stretched up so high that she could barely see the ceiling. Everything here was built for beings much larger than humans. The Krex warriors stood 12 feet tall with their thick armor plates. The graceful Velthani floated rather than walked, their long robes trailing behind them like liquid silk. Even the smallest council members, the crystal-bodied Luminians, were twice as tall as any human. Sarah had been walking these halls for 15 years now. She knew every shortcut, every maintenance tunnel, every service elevator that the other species never bothered to notice. While the grand delegates used the main transport platforms that announced their arrival with ceremonial music, Sarah often took the back routes that human technicians had quietly mapped out over the decades. Today was like any other day in the council chambers. The great circular room buzzed with the voices of 47 different species. Each had their own translation device, but the humans had long ago learned to speak most of the major languages directly. It was just easier that way. The trade dispute between the Zephyrian Commerce Guild and the Outer Rim Mining Consortium requires immediate attention, announced Councillor Vex Thera. His blue-scaled head gleamed under the chamber lights as he gestured with 4 arms toward the holographic display showing shipping routes and resource charts. Sarah pulled up her tablet and quickly scanned the files. She had spent the previous night reviewing every detail of this case. The humans always did their homework. They knew that being prepared was the only way to earn even basic respect in these chambers. The mining rights were clearly established in Galactic Standard Year 4247, rumbled General Thokvar of the Krex Military Alliance. His voice was so deep that Sarah felt it in her chest. The Zephyrians cannot simply ignore established law because it is no longer profitable for them. Councillor Velthari of the Velthani Ascendancy raised one delicate hand. When she spoke, her words came out like music. My dear General, profit is not the issue here. The question is whether the original agreements took into account the environmental impact on the local star system. Surely we must consider the long-term consequences of such aggressive mining operations. Sarah watched the familiar dance begin. The Krex would demand military enforcement of the existing contracts. The Velthani would propose elegant diplomatic solutions that would take decades to implement. The Zephyrians would calculate exactly how much profit they were losing each day the dispute continued, and the smaller species would eventually choose sides based on their own narrow interests. She had seen this same pattern hundreds of times. Everyone talked past each other, focusing on their own species' concerns while missing the bigger picture. If I may, Sarah said quietly, standing up. She had to speak up because the microphone systems were designed for larger beings. The chamber didn't exactly fall silent, but the volume dropped slightly. Some delegates looked her way with mild curiosity. Others continued their side conversations as if she hadn't spoken at all. We have reviewed the complete history of this trade route, Sarah continued. The original mining rights date back to 4247, but the shipping agreements were updated in 4381 to account for increased traffic. The environmental impact studies were completed in 4385, and the Zephyrian Commerce Guild agreed to new profit-sharing ratios in 4390. She touched her tablet and sent data packets to every delegate's personal system. If you examine the complete timeline, you can see that both parties have legitimate claims based on different parts of the agreement process. However, there is a solution that addresses everyone's concerns. Sarah pulled up a 3-dimensional map of the disputed region. The humans have been monitoring this sector for the past 50 years as part of our infrastructure maintenance duties. We have identified 3 alternative shipping routes that would reduce environmental impact while actually increasing profit margins for both parties. The key is coordinating the mining schedules with the shipping windows to maximize efficiency. She highlighted different sections of her data. The Krex concerns about law enforcement can be addressed by updating the original contracts rather than voiding them. The Velthani environmental protections can be implemented using technology that the humans developed for similar situations in our own systems, and the Zephyrian profit margins actually improve by approximately 12% under this new arrangement. For a moment, the chamber was genuinely quiet. Sarah could see delegates reviewing her data, their faces showing surprise as they realized how thoroughly the humans had analyzed the situation. Then General Thukvar snorted. The humans present interesting data, but they lack the authority to enforce such agreements. What happens when one party decides to ignore these new arrangements? My dear General, Velthari said with a slight smile, enforcement is precisely why we need more elegant solutions. The humans show admirable attention to detail, but they do not understand the complex political realities involved in such negotiations. Councillor Vexthara nodded agreement. The human analysis is thorough, as always. But this matter requires decisions from species with significant military and economic power. Perhaps the humans could prepare a detailed report for our review? Sarah sat back down. She had expected this response. It was the same thing that happened every time humans offered solutions. Their work was appreciated. Their data was useful. But the actual decisions would be made by the senior species, who had the real power. Of course, Counselor, she replied politely. We will have a full report ready by tomorrow morning. As the debate resumed, Sarah watched the familiar patterns play out again. The Krex demanded immediate action. The Velthani proposed studying the issue for 6 more months. The Zephyrians calculated costs and benefits while ignoring the broader implications. The smaller species chose sides and prepared for a long political fight. By the end of the session, nothing had been decided except to meet again next week. The dispute would continue draining resources from both sides, while ships had to take longer routes around the affected systems. Meanwhile, the real impact fell on the independent traders and small colonies that depended on those shipping lanes. Sarah gathered her materials and headed back to the human embassy. She would spend the evening preparing the report that the council had requested, knowing that it would probably sit unread in their files for months. This was how things worked in the Galactic Confederation. The humans did the research, maintained the systems, and provided the solutions. Everyone else made the decisions and took the credit. For now, that arrangement worked fine for humanity. They were patient people, and they understood that real influence came not from making speeches, but from becoming indispensable. But Sarah wondered sometimes what would happen if that patience ever ran out. The emergency alarm echoed through the council chambers for the first time in over 300 years. Ambassador Sarah Chen looked up from her morning reports as delegates rushed to their seats, their faces showing confusion and concern. We have received confirmation of attacks on 12 Outer Rim colonies, announced Supreme Councillor Zarthak, his massive form casting shadows across the central platform. The attacking force appears to be a previously unknown species. They are calling themselves the Devourers. The main holographic display lit up with star maps showing the affected systems. Red markers indicated destroyed colonies, while yellow ones showed settlements under attack. Sarah studied the pattern and felt her stomach drop. The attacks weren't random. They followed a clear progression, moving inward toward more populated systems. What do we know about these Devourers? Asked Councillor Vexthara, his blue scales shifting nervously. General Thokvar stepped forward, his armor clanking with each movement. Intelligence reports indicate a highly aggressive species with advanced military technology. They do not respond to communication attempts. They arrive at a system, destroy all structures and life, then move on to the next target. How many ships? Velthari inquired, her musical voice tight with concern. Estimates range from 500 to 2,000 vessels, the general replied. Their exact numbers are difficult to determine because they use some form of stealth technology that interferes with our sensors. Sarah raised her hand. Ambassador Chen, you have reviewed the available data? Yes, Supreme Councillor. The humans have been tracking unusual energy signatures in those regions for the past 6 months. We filed reports about possible hostile activity, but they were classified as low priority since no direct contact had been made. She touched her tablet and shared her analysis with the chamber. Based on the attack patterns and the energy signatures we detected, we estimate the Devourer force includes approximately 800 ships. They appear to be strip mining entire planets for resources before moving on. Sarah highlighted several sections of her data. More concerning is their movement pattern. They are not attacking randomly. They are following established trade routes and targeting systems with specific resource types. At their current pace, they will reach major population centers within 18 months. 18 months gives us plenty of time to prepare a proper response, Velthari said smoothly. We should establish a diplomatic committee to attempt communication. Perhaps these devourers can be reasoned with. General Thokvar growled his disagreement. Diplomacy is useless against an enemy that destroys everything in its path. We need immediate military mobilization. The Krex military alliance can have battle fleets deployed to the Outer Rim within 4 weeks. Military action without understanding our enemy's motivations would be foolish, Velthari countered. The Velthani Ascendancy recommends a careful study of their technology and tactics before committing to any aggressive response. Councillor Vex Thara spread his forearms wide. The Zephyrian Commerce Guild is most concerned about the economic impact. These attacks are disrupting trade routes and causing massive refugee movements. We need to establish secure shipping lanes and refugee processing centers immediately. Sarah stood up again. The human delegation has prepared a comprehensive response plan that addresses all these concerns. Quote, she activated the main display and showed a detailed operational timeline. We recommend immediate evacuation of all colonies within the projected attack path. Our analysis indicates we can save approximately 2 million lives if we begin evacuations within the next 72 hours. The display showed evacuation routes, refugee resettlement plans, and defensive positions. Simultaneously, we should establish a coordinated defense network using existing military assets from all member species. The key is not to meet them head-on, but to slow their advance while we evacuate civilian populations. Sarah highlighted specific sections of her plan. We have identified 17 strategic positions where combined fleets can force the devourers to fight in disadvantageous conditions. This will buy time for evacuations while gathering intelligence about their capabilities. The humans also recommend establishing communication protocols based on mathematical and scientific principles rather than language, she continued. Our xenolinguistics teams have developed several approaches that might work even with hostile species. For several minutes, the chamber was quiet as delegates reviewed the human proposal. Sarah could see them studying the data, following the logical progression of her recommendations, checking the resource requirements and timeline estimates. Then General Thokvar shook his massive head. The human plan is too cautious. We cannot appear weak by running away from our own territories. The Krex military alliance will not participate in mass evacuations. We fight for our worlds. We do not abandon them. I must agree that evacuation sends the wrong message, Velthari added gently. The Velthani Ascendancy believes in the power of careful negotiation. Rushing into military action or evacuation procedures could prevent us from finding a peaceful solution. Councillor Vex Thara nodded. The Zephyrian Commerce Guild is concerned about the economic costs of mass evacuations. Moving 2 million people would require enormous resources and disrupt trade throughout the entire sector. Sarah felt the familiar frustration building. With respect, councillors, the economic cost of evacuation is significantly less than the cost of losing entire planets. And we cannot negotiate with an enemy that has not responded to any communication attempts. Ambassador Chen, Supreme Councillor Zarthok said firmly, humanity's caution is understandable given your species' limited military experience. However, this council includes several species with thousands of years of warfare and diplomacy behind them. Perhaps it would be better to leave these decisions to those with greater expertise in such matters. The words stung, but Sarah kept her expression neutral. Of course, Supreme Councillor. We simply wanted to share our analysis in case it proved useful. Over the following hours, the debate continued. The Krex insisted on immediate military response. The Velthani demanded diplomatic initiatives. The Zephyrians focused on economic concerns. Smaller species took sides based on their own interests and alliances. The Council ultimately approved a compromise plan that satisfied no one and addressed none of the core problems. A small diplomatic mission would attempt to contact the Devourers while battle fleets moved to defensive positions around major systems. Evacuation procedures would be considered for the most threatened colonies. Sarah watched the votes being cast and saw the familiar pattern playing out on a larger scale. Each species was thinking about their own concerns, while missing the bigger picture. The Kreks wanted to look strong, the Velthani wanted to look civilized, the Zephyrians wanted to protect their profits. None of them were thinking about the 2 million people who would die while they argued about politics. As the session ended, Sarah gathered her materials and prepared for another long night of work. The humans would implement their own evacuation procedures for colonies that requested help. They would share intelligence with whoever wanted it. They would continue doing the actual work, while everyone else made the official decisions. But for the first time in her 15 years of service, Sarah found herself wondering if this arrangement was really working for anyone. The council members seemed more interested in preserving their own status than solving actual problems. And when those problems finally became too big to ignore, it would be too late for millions of people who deserved better. She walked through the grand corridors one more time, listening to delegates arguing about procedure and protocol, while somewhere in the darkness beyond the rim, the Devourers continued their methodical advance toward the heart of civilization. The humans would keep working, keep trying to help, keep believing that eventually reason would prevail. But Sarah was beginning to suspect that some problems were too big to solve from the sidelines. 3 months had passed since the first Devourer attacks, and Sarah Chen sat in her office reviewing the casualty reports. 27 colonies had fallen. The diplomatic mission had failed when the Devourers destroyed the contact ship without any attempt at communication. The defensive fleets were engaged in a series of running battles that they were slowly losing. Most troubling of all, the refugee situation was becoming a disaster. Ships arrived at processing centers with thousands of people aboard, only to find the facilities overcrowded and undersupplied. Other refugee convoys never arrived at all. Their evacuation ships lost somewhere between the destroyed colonies and safety. Sarah had watched the same pattern repeat itself over and over. The council would meet, debate, and pass resolutions. Then nothing would happen because no one wanted to take responsibility for actually implementing the decisions. Everyone was too busy protecting their own interests to focus on solving the crisis. She looked up as her assistant knocked on the door. "Ambassador, Director Martinez is here to see you." Carlos Martinez entered the office, carrying a secure data pad. As Director of Human Operations for the Galactic Confederation, he oversaw the thousands of human personnel who worked throughout Council space. Sarah had known him for 20 years, and she could tell from his expression that something significant was happening. "Sarah, I need to show you something," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. "This came down from Earth this morning. Classified at the highest levels." He handed her the data pad. The message was brief and formal, effective immediately. All human personnel assigned to Galactic Confederation operations are to begin withdrawal procedures. This withdrawal will be conducted in a professional manner with appropriate transition periods for all ongoing responsibilities. Target completion date is 90 days from this order. Sarah read the message twice, then looked up at Carlos. "This is real? As real as it gets." The order comes directly from the Global Council on Earth. Every human facility, every posting, every assignment throughout Confederation space. She set down the data pad and stared out the window at the massive council complex. Thousands of humans worked in this building alone. They maintained the computer networks, operated the communication systems, managed the logistics that kept 47 different species fed and housed and able to work together. "Do we know why?" Sarah asked. Carlos sat down and activated a privacy shield around the office. "The official reason is to focus resources on internal human development. But between you and me, I think Earth has finally gotten tired of watching us bang our heads against this particular wall." Sarah thought about the last 3 months. Every human proposal had been dismissed or modified beyond recognition. Every warning had been ignored until it was too late. Every solution had been set aside in favor of political compromise that solved nothing. "How long do we have?" she asked. "For you, longer than most. As ambassador, you'll need to stay until the end to handle the formal transition. But most of our people will be gone within 30 days. Over the next few hours, Sarah met with her senior staff to begin planning the withdrawal. The humans had spent 200 years becoming integrated into every aspect of Council operations. Pulling them out would require careful coordination to avoid causing unnecessary disruption. "What about the evacuation operations?" asked Dr. Emily Watson, head of the Human Refugee Assistance Program. We have ships en route to 12 different systems right now. Complete all current operations, Sarah replied, but don't start any new ones. Transfer responsibility to council authorities wherever possible. The communication networks are going to be a problem, said Technical Director James Park. Humans manage the quantum relay systems for most of the outer territories. Without us, they'll lose contact with about 60% of their remote facilities. Sarah nodded. Document everything. Create detailed operation manuals. Train local personnel wherever they're willing to learn. We're not sabotaging anything on our way out. The next morning, Sarah requested time to address the council. She stood at the human delegation podium and looked out at the familiar faces of beings she had worked with for 15 years. Distinguished counselors, she began. I have an announcement to make on behalf of the human delegation to this body. The chamber was only half full, as usual for morning sessions. Many delegates were still dealing with their own crisis management meetings. After 200 years of participation in the Galactic Confederation, humanity has decided to withdraw from this organization to focus on our own internal development and the needs of human colonies. That got their attention. Conversations stopped, and delegates turned to look at her directly. This decision is effective immediately. All human personnel will be withdrawn from council operations over the next 90 days. We will work to ensure smooth transitions of our responsibilities, and will provide full documentation for all ongoing projects. Supreme Counselor Zarthak leaned forward. Ambassador Chen, this seems rather sudden. Has this decision been prompted by recent events? Sarah had prepared for this question. No. Supreme Counselor. This decision reflects a long-term strategic assessment by human leadership. We believe our resources can be better utilized in other areas. What about your obligations to ongoing council operations? Asked Counselor Vexthera. Humans are involved in numerous critical projects. We will fulfill all existing obligations and provide complete transition support, Sarah replied. However, we will not be accepting any new assignments or commitments. General Thokvar snorted dismissively. Perhaps this is for the best. The humans have always been too cautious for effective decision-making anyway. Their withdrawal will allow the council to take more decisive action. Velthari nodded gracefully. While we regret humanity's decision, we respect their right to choose their own path. The council has functioned for millennia before human participation and will continue to do so. The economic impact should be minimal, added Counselor Vexthara. Human contributions to the council budget represent less than 3% of total revenues. Sarah listened to their responses and felt a mix of sadness and relief. Even now, they were missing the point. They thought this was about money or political influence. They still didn't understand what humans actually did in this organization. We thank the Council for 200 years of cooperation, Sarah concluded. We wish you success in your future endeavors. As she left the podium, she could hear the discussions beginning behind her. Some delegates seemed relieved. Others were mildly concerned about the logistics of human withdrawal. None of them seemed to grasp the magnitude of what was happening. Over the following weeks, Sarah watched the withdrawal process unfold with professional efficiency. Human technicians completed their final maintenance cycles and handed over passwords and access codes. Human administrators finished their reports and trained local replacements wherever possible. Human mediators resolved their ongoing cases and transferred active files to council authorities. There were no protests, no dramatic speeches, no angry confrontations. The humans simply completed their work and left. Communications specialist Lisa Park spent her final week creating detailed manuals for the quantum relay network. I tried to train the Luminian technicians, she told Sarah. But they don't really understand how the whole system works together. They know how to operate individual components, but they've never seen the big picture. Logistics coordinator Mike Torres had a similar experience. The Zephyrians can handle the trade calculations, and the Kreks understand military supply chains, but nobody wants to learn how to coordinate between different systems. They all want to stick to their own specialty areas. As the last human ships prepared to leave council space, Sarah walked through the embassy one final time. The building felt empty even though council security forces had already moved in to take over the facility. She thought about all the work that humans had done here, all the problems they had solved, all the crises they had helped manage, all the quiet contributions that had kept this massive organization functioning. Soon, the council would find out what it was like to operate without that support. Sarah just hoped they would figure it out before it was too late. 6 weeks after the last human ships had departed council space, Councillor Vex's Thara stood in his office staring at a screen full of error messages. The quarterly trade reports that should have been automatically generated and distributed to all member governments had simply not appeared. When his staff investigated, they discovered that the human-designed integration software had stopped functioning. "What do you mean the system requires manual updates?" he asked his chief aide, a fellow Zephyrian named Kextari. The software was designed to automatically pull data from 47 different government databases, convert it into standardized formats, perform economic analysis, and generate summary reports, Kextari explained. But apparently it needs to be recalibrated every few months to account for changes in data formats, new trade agreements, and economic policy adjustments. Vexthera gestured with 2 of his forearms. "So recalibrate it. We don't know how." The humans who designed the system left detailed manuals, but the recalibration process requires understanding the entire integration framework. Our economists know how to read the reports, but they don't know how the underlying software works. This same conversation was happening throughout the council complex. In the communication center, Luminian technicians watched helplessly as connection delays between outer rim systems grew longer each day. The quantum relay network that humans had maintained for decades was developing problems that no one knew how to fix. "The relays are still functioning," explained senior technician Velmarti to his supervisor. "But the optimization algorithms are failing. Messages that used to take minutes to transmit are now taking hours." The supervisor, a crystalline being whose name translated roughly to bright signal, pulsed with frustrated colors. "Contact the manufacturers of the relay equipment. We tried. They built the hardware, but the humans wrote all the software that makes it efficient. The original manufacturers say it would take them 6 months to recreate the optimization systems from scratch." Similar problems were emerging across all council operations. The automated resource allocation system that distributed supplies throughout council space was making increasingly poor decisions. Medical supplies were being sent to colonies that needed food, while emergency provisions were routed to peaceful systems that had no current crises. Dr. Zolthani, a Velthani physician working in the Refugee Coordination Center, found herself dealing with a catastrophe that grew worse each day. "We have 17 ships full of refugees en route to Station Delta 7, she reported to her supervisor. "But Delta 7 only has housing for about 300 people. And these ships are carrying nearly 2,000. "What about the other processing stations?" asked Coordinator Melvani. "Station Beta 3 has empty housing for 5,000, but no ships are being routed there. The logistics system seems to have stopped considering travel distances and capacity limits when making assignments." The problems cascaded through every aspect of council operations. Military coordination, which had never been perfect, became nearly impossible as communication delays made real-time tactical planning impractical. Ships arrived at battle zones to find that their allies had already left, or that the enemy had moved on days earlier. General Thokvar stood in the war room watching his carefully planned defensive strategy fall apart in real time. "How long until we can re-establish contact with the 7th Fleet?" he demanded. "Unknown, General," replied his aide. "The communication routing system is sending their messages through a relay station that's been offline for 3 days. The backup routing protocols seem to be malfunctioning." "What about direct communication?" "That would require manually calculating transmission paths and relay timing for each message. Our communication officers estimate it would take approximately 4 hours to send a simple status update to the 7th Fleet. 4 hours to send a message that used to take 4 minutes. General Thokvar realized with growing alarm that his forces were becoming deaf and blind, just when they needed coordination most. The Devourer threat, meanwhile, had not paused for the Council's internal difficulties. They continued their steady advance, destroying colonies and consuming resources, while the Council's response became increasingly chaotic. Refugee ships that should have reached safety were lost in space because no one knew how to update their navigation data. Supply convoys arrived at the wrong destinations because the automated routing system was making decisions based on outdated information. Military fleets found themselves fighting alone because their reinforcements had been sent to completely different star systems. Supreme Counselor Zarthak called an emergency session to address the growing crisis. The chamber was packed, as delegates tried to understand what was happening to their organization. "We are experiencing systematic failures across multiple operational areas," he announced. "Our technical staff report that many of these problems stem from the departure of human personnel who maintained critical systems." The statement caused an uproar. Delegates who had barely noticed the human withdrawal suddenly realized its implications. "Are you saying that humans were somehow essential to Council operations?" demanded Councillor Velthari. "We have been managing interstellar civilization for millennia. Surely we cannot be dependent on a species that has only been spacefaring for a few centuries." "The problem appears to be integration," explained Technical Coordinator Lumdari, one of the few beings who had worked closely with human technicians. Each species contributed their best technology to Council operations. The Luminians built excellent communication hardware. The Zephyrians designed efficient economic analysis tools. The Velthani created sophisticated diplomatic databases. He paused, his crystalline form flickering nervously. But no one except the humans understood how all these different systems worked together. They created the software bridges, the translation protocols, the coordination algorithms that made it possible for our technologies to function as a unified whole. General Thokvar slammed his armored fist on his desk. "Then we get the humans back. Send a delegation to Earth immediately." "On what grounds?" asked Councillor Vexthara. "They fulfilled all their obligations before leaving. They provided transition, documentation, and training. They didn't violate any agreements or break any laws. Besides," added Velthari thoughtfully, "what do we offer them? They asked for nothing when they left. They made no demands, presented no ultimatums. What could we possibly provide that would convince them to return?" The question hung in the air as delegates realized the uncomfortable truth. The humans had not left because they wanted something the Council wouldn't give them. They had left because they no longer saw any value in staying. As the emergency session continued through the day, more reports of system failures arrived. The problems were accelerating as automated processes that depended on human-maintained algorithms began to break down completely. "How long do we have?" asked Supreme Counselor Zarthak. Technical Coordinator Lumdari consulted his reports. "If current trends continue, we estimate complete breakdown of inter-system coordination within 30 days. Essential services like communication and resource distribution will become unreliable within 2 weeks." The chamber fell silent as delegates absorbed this information. The mighty Galactic Confederation, which had governed dozens of species across thousands of star systems, was falling apart because a single species had quietly walked away. "There's something else," Lumdari continued reluctantly. "We've been monitoring human communications since their departure. They're not struggling with any of these problems. Their own colonies are functioning normally. Their refugee assistance programs are still helping anyone who asks for aid. And their defensive operations against the Devourers have been remarkably effective." General Thokvar leaned forward. "What do you mean? Effective? Human colonies have successfully evacuated 12 systems ahead of Devourer advances. They've established secure refugee camps that are actually functioning properly. And their military forces have managed to slow Devourer advances in 3 different sectors using coordinated hit-and-run tactics." The implications were clear. The humans had not lost their ability to manage complex operations when they left the Council. If anything, they seemed to be doing better on their own. For the first time in the Council's long history, its members began to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake. But the question that no one wanted to ask was whether it was already too late to fix it. The diplomatic ship Council Unity emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system 6 months after the human withdrawal. Aboard were 5 of the most senior members of the Galactic Confederation Council. sent on a mission that none of them had imagined they would ever need to undertake. Counselor Vexi Thara stood at the observation deck, watching Earth grow larger on the view screen. The blue-green world looked peaceful and unremarkable, compared to the magnificent crystal cities of the Luminians, or the floating palace worlds of the Velthani. But this simple planet had somehow become the key to saving their entire civilization. Incoming transmission from Earth Traffic Control, announced the ship's Luminian communications officer. They're directing us to a standard orbital approach vector. No special protocols, no diplomatic fanfare. Supreme Counselor Zarthak nodded grimly. They're treating us like any other visiting ship. The past month had been a disaster beyond imagination. The Council's communication network had collapsed completely, leaving most member worlds unable to coordinate with their neighbors. The economic distribution system had failed so catastrophically that some planets were experiencing famines, while others had warehouses full of rotting supplies they couldn't distribute. Most critically, the Devourer advance had accelerated. Without proper military coordination, the Council's defensive fleets had been picked off one by one. 17 more systems had fallen in just the past 2 weeks, and refugee ships were arriving at processing centers that had no resources to help them. The Council Unity docked at a modest orbital station that was clearly designed for function, rather than ceremony. As the delegation disembarked, they were met by a single human official, Director Margaret Kim of Earth's External Relations Office. "Welcome to Earth," she said politely. "I understand you've requested a meeting with our Global Council leadership." "Thank you for seeing us," replied Supreme Counselor Zarthak. "We hope that our governments can work together to address the current crisis." Director Kim led them through clean, efficient corridors toward the shuttle bay. "I should mention that our Global Council is currently in emergency session dealing with refugee coordination. We're processing about 50,000 people per day from the affected systems." Counselor Velthari looked surprised. 50,000 per day? But how are you managing the logistics? "Our own refugee operations collapsed weeks ago. We use the same coordination systems we've always used," Director Kim replied simply. "The same ones we tried to share with the Council for the past 2 centuries. The shuttle ride down to Earth was silent, as the delegates absorbed this information. From orbit, they could see massive refugee camps that looked organized and functional. Supply ships moved in coordinated patterns, and communication arrays buzzed with constant traffic. The Earth Global Council met in a building that was impressive in its simplicity. No towering architecture or magnificent decorations, just a circular chamber where representatives from every human colony and Earth nation could gather to make decisions. President Maria Santos of the Global Council greeted the delegation personally. "Counselors, we're honored by your visit. How can Earth help you today?" Supreme Counselor Zarthak had prepared a formal speech about mutual cooperation and shared interests. Instead, he found himself asking a simple question. "How do we fix this?" President Santos gestured toward a wall display showing the current state of Council space. Red zones marked areas where communication had been lost. Yellow zones showed regions with degraded services. Green zones were limited to a few core systems around the most technically advanced homeworlds. "The immediate problem is coordination," she said matter-of-factly. "Your individual species have excellent capabilities, but you've lost the ability to work together effectively. Food sits in warehouses on Zephyrian worlds, while people starve on Velthani colonies, because your distribution network can't match needs with resources." She highlighted different sections of the display. "Your military forces are fighting the same enemy in isolation, which means the Devourers can defeat you one fleet at a time. Your refugee operations are sending people to facilities that closed weeks ago because your information systems can't track capacity in real time." General Thakvar leaned forward. "We understand the problems. What we need is solutions." President Santos turned to face the delegation directly. "The solution is integration, not political integration. You've proven that doesn't work. Operational integration. Someone needs to build and maintain the systems that allow different species to work together effectively. That someone was humanity," Counselor Vex Thara said quietly. "Wasn't it? Wasn't it? For 200 years, yes. We built the bridges between your technologies, maintained the coordination protocols, and handled the integration challenges that no one else wanted to deal with. Counselor Velthari spoke carefully. Would humanity consider returning to the Council to restore these systems? President Santos was quiet for a long moment. Counselor, we left because our contributions were not valued. Every suggestion was dismissed. Every solution was modified beyond effectiveness. Every warning was ignored until it was too late. She gestured toward another display showing human colonies and operations. Since leaving, we've expanded our refugee assistance programs, improved our defensive capabilities, and strengthened our relationships with dozens of independent systems that were never part of the Council. We're doing more good now than we ever did as Council members. But what about the Council itself? Asked Supreme Counselor Zarthak. Millions of people are suffering because our systems are failing. Yes, President Santos agreed sadly. And that's tragic. But humanity spent 2 centuries trying to help the Council work better. We were told repeatedly that our ideas were too cautious, too complicated, too focused on mundane details, instead of grand political goals. She stood up and walked to the window overlooking Earth's capital city. The truth is, counselors, the Council doesn't want to be fixed. It wants to maintain the same power structures and decision-making processes that created this crisis. Bringing humans back would only delay the inevitable collapse by another few decades. The delegation exchanged glances. They had all hoped for a simple solution. Apologize to humanity, offer them better terms, and restore the old arrangements. Instead, they were learning that the problem was much deeper than they had realized. What if we offered humanity a different role? Suggested Counselor Vex Thera. Full Council membership, voting rights equal to any other species, complete authority over system integration? President Santos shook her head. You're missing the point. This isn't about humanity's status within the Council. It's about whether the Council's fundamental approach to governance can work in the modern galaxy. She activated a holographic display showing the current state of the crisis. Look at what's happening. The Devourers are a serious threat. But they're not unstoppable. The real problem is that the Council can't coordinate an effective response because each species is more concerned with protecting their own interests than solving shared problems. Humans offered you comprehensive evacuation plans, coordinated defense strategies, and communication protocols that could have saved millions of lives. You rejected those plans not because they were wrong, but because implementing them would have required trusting each other and working toward common goals. General Thakvar slammed his fist on the table. So what do you suggest? That we just give up? Let the Council collapse completely? Maybe. President Santos said calmly. Maybe the Council has served its purpose, and it's time for something new. Maybe instead of trying to force 47 species to work within a single massive government, the galaxy needs smaller, more flexible alliances based on actual cooperation rather than political necessity. She gestured toward the display again. Humanity is already part of several such alliances. Independent systems that work together when it benefits everyone and pursue their own paths when it doesn't. No grand political structure, no hierarchy of senior and junior species. Just practical cooperation when it serves everyone's interests. The meeting continued for several more hours, but the delegation gradually realized that their mission had failed. Humanity would not be returning to save the Council. They had moved on to something better. As their ship departed Earth, Counselor Vexthara stood again at the observation deck. Behind them, the blue-green world continued its ancient rotation, peaceful and confident in its own path forward. What do we tell the Council? Asked Counselor Velthari. Supreme Counselor Zarthak was quiet for a long moment. We tell them the truth. That we spent so long thinking about who deserved to lead, that we forgot to ask who knew how to serve. The journey back to Council space took 3 days. When they arrived, they found that 2 more core systems had lost communication, and that the Devourers had advanced to within 50 light-years of the Council capital itself. In the end, the mighty Galactic Confederation would survive, but only as a shadow of its former self. Several species withdrew to focus on their own territories. Others formed smaller alliances with neighbors who shared their values and priorities. The Council chambers, which had once hosted dozens of species debating the fate of the galaxy, eventually held only a handful of delegates managing the basic needs of their remaining member worlds. But throughout the galaxy, new forms of cooperation emerged. Independent systems that had learned from humanity's example built their own networks of mutual aid and defense. Refugee assistance programs, operated by species that valued practical results over political prestige. Military alliances based on shared operational doctrines rather than ancient treaties, and at the center of many of these new alliances were humans, not as leaders or rulers, but as the bridges that made cooperation possible. They had learned that sometimes the greatest strength was not the power to force others to follow, but the wisdom to know when it was time to walk away and build something better. The galaxy had learned an important lesson, though it had cost millions of lives to learn it. Civilizations were not held together by the loudest voices or the strongest military forces, but by the quiet work of those who understood that everyone's success depended on everyone else's well-being. In the end, the humans had not retreated at all. They had simply stopped wasting their time trying to fix a system that didn't want to be fixed, and had begun building the future that actually worked.